So, quite unsurprisingly, Steven Pinker has not shown up. I believe the reason for this is that he has blocked everyone other than maybe his own self from Twitter, so we were unable to, in fact, contact him. We did try to get the message out that we would be debating his work this afternoon. Perhaps, hopefully he was not on any private jets or anything traveling to remote islands at the time. So Steven Pinker refuses to debate. We'll have to make do without him, so I'll introduce our wonderful cast of characters. We've got the woke sorcerer here. Hello, Joe.
Hey. Hello, Eric. Hi.
How are you?
Well, I'm very good. I'm joining you from a secret location, not on a private island. I haven't come here by private jet. My internet's much better, so I'm really happy. But also, I'm confused that I remain unblocked and platformed by Professor Pinker.
Well, maybe
I'm just not, important enough, or I don't know. But yeah.
Well, I don't know. Again, I mean, the thing I was surprised by was Free Speech Live itself was blocked, and as you all know, we have about 100 followers. So it's one thing. It's one thing to block really, or such as our guest coming up. I assume that you're also blocked. But first, we'll bring up Carl to see if he's blocked at all. Hi, Carl. How are you?
Hey, Carl.
How are you
Good
guys?
To see you.
I don't get blocked. I remain unblocked and platformed due to my lack of Twitter activity.
Okay.
That's how you do it.
So if you don't send any tweets, then you don't get blocked by Steven Pinker.
That doesn't work for me, though.
Anonymity is my key. So it seems
well done. And so we're very pleased that I would venture to say an expert in Steven Pinkerism. Or what Pinker is up to is our guest, which we're very grateful for joining us from. Is it Canada?
Yeah,
Professor Ted McCormick. Hello.
Hi. Thanks.
How are you?
Hi, Ted.
Hello. We meet at last, sort of.
Hi.
You meet at last, almost. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it must be
I've been so
quite
excited
early.
about
Are
this.
you? Is it Montreal or?
Yeah, it's Montreal.
Oh, great. So it must be quite early in the morning there.
Well, 9.
Nine's
I'd usually be awake by now.
Okay, good. We're not still students, yes.
Yeah.
But we're very grateful for you for joining us, and it feels a bit like Twitter's coming into real life. Not quite, but
for me too.
Emerging into real conversations because. I feel like you were one of the early folks to pick up on. I distinctly remember with So-Called Squared, and we debated whether James Lindsay was warranted as an invitee.
Right.
But he might sword. He's got a sword play, or he might come and. He's a bit nearer to you as well, so you'd want to watch out for
Yeah,
him.
well, in a general way. Actually, I don't think he is any nearer than Pinker. But yeah, he does seem more bloody-minded.
Yes. Well, and according to Pinker, violence has ended as well, hasn't it?
Well,
Yeah. Yeah. Good to know.
So, Ted, would you mind going through? We've got our free speech news to run through, and then I'd love to talk a bit more with you about Steven Pinker et al. Yeah?
Sure.
Okay. So this is the past 2 weeks of free speech issues coming up. Okay, so the first thing that came up, Ted, tell us if you've not come across any of these stories. The first is that GB News. Have you come across GB News?
I feel like I've seen it, but I can't claim to be familiar. No.
Okay, so GB News is essentially they're trying to be Fox News.
Okay.
It was set up by, is it Andrew Neil? the chairman
Andrew
of
Neil,
Spectator.
A kind of right wing, used to work for the BBC. He's called Brillo. He's called Brillo as a nickname because he's like a Brillo pad when he gets going on people. But it is,
and so they've one of the more humorous aspects that we've covered in the past few weeks is they've got several things like Woke Watch and This Week in Free Speech or whatever, cancel culture. But probably the people canceling them the most are their sort of camera operators, like their sets keep falling apart and breaking and things. But in this one, this is an amusing situation where Guto Hari, who I think left BBC to... What is it?
Guto Hari.
Guto. After the football and the discussion about taking the knee, he took a knee as part of like an impromptu moment. And despite all of these programs about free speech and cancel culture, GB News, like the audience insisted that they get rid of him for having taken the knee. And what did they do? They sort of boycotted several of the programs, so they had 0 viewers because all of the people were so offended by the knee taking. So GB News ended up firing this guy.
Yeah. Awkward.
I think the really surreal
even
thing
Andrew. Sorry, Carl. Go ahead.
Well, just very briefly.
I was going to say
Let's go with Carl.
Yeah, just super briefly, I think that there's a deeper irony in that he wasn't even taking the knee. He was trying to say this isn't a controversial thing to do by taking the knee for kind of a second and then standing back up. And even this kind of statement of non-controversialness became a moment of more controversy. It's kind of through the looking glass by this point.
Yeah.
And this is, I quite like the idea that this is an unacceptable breach of their standards, because I'm not quite sure what
I'd like to see a list of
their
standards.
Might be.
Standards. Well, even Andrew Lillico, the sort of right-wing, anti-woke, whatever was saying that he thought it was absolutely ridiculous. So if Andrew Lillico is telling you this is ridiculous, I mean, yeah.
And so, so that was one amusing episode this week, and goes to show you how... I'm not sure if they had to present themselves on Woke Watch for canceling themselves that week.
Well, that'd be surely.
They've got Nigel.
Let's move on to the next... Let's just quickly move on to the next, which is that someone today... and I've not heard of this person. Does anyone know this person? Charles Arthur?
No.
Charles Arthur. No?
Don't think so.
So he was reporting on how J.K. Rowling has been presented to unacceptable, and that this was just like Gamergate. There's some commentary of this fellow saying, well, if you're talking about Gamergate, the gender critical side is the one that's hounding people. And so this gentleman says, what if I suggested that the problem is polarization and extremism rather than which side you are on? Someone said, well, you might want to read some of what the gender critical folks say. And then this is the moment that we were waiting for. If you didn't know, Gamergate was extremist on both sides. Which is really interesting to think about, what the women's side of Gamergate, how that was extreme.
Yeah.
It's very odd, this thing of kind of people who are engaging in systemized online harassment are being opposed, and that's somehow both sides. I don't understand how that gets both sided. There must be a limit to... I don't know, like if you're a Nazi and I oppose you, like there isn't a both sides to that narrative.
Well,
when I went Nazi very early.
Oh, Twitter.
It's at some point that there has to be a paradigm by which something is just considered outrageous and offensive and systematic harassment, and opposing that doesn't require some kind of middle ground. But,
Well,
But I think that's the whole thing, though. I mean, if it's as soon as there are two sides, there's a center, right? And if you're committed to being in the center, then some side, I mean, each of those sides has an extreme, more or less, by definition. So there you go,
so you
extremist.
always have to, but the idea that both sides are extreme as well is really interesting. So, and polarization, it's kind of like, because Gamergate to me, that's a clear, like, women were being attacked, right? I mean, there wasn't, I don't remember any, I don't know, was there like some unreasonable defense of women in that situation? Because there was like death threats being systematically sent towards certain, was it video game designers?
Yeah.
That were women.
And at
That's
the time,
extreme.
I remember it was said that it was all about ethics in games journalism. Actually, it's about ethics in games journalism.
Right.
And it's like, I think you'll find it's just basically misogyny. And in this, both sides, one side has kind of been driven to kind of leaving their homes, scared of being murdered and becoming suicidal. And on the other side, you have some men that are angry about the fact that women might want a place at the table, I guess. And it's quite clear cut to me, and I don't really see that this is particularly difficult to grasp.
Right.
But
you know, we've got our Charles Arthur, who's apparently a very important Guardian journalist, a member of Crash that's at Cambridge. I thought that you might, with history of science and so forth, but who knows? And here's James pointing out, you know, the gender critical stuff is quite a gateway drug into this particular.
It is.
Both sidesing. So let's.
Yeah, that seems to be working that way.
Yeah. Well, so we'll conclude very quickly with the final bit of news this week, which is, I don't know if you've heard, but cancel culture is the sign of the end times.
Okay, I'm done.
Could it just hurry up then? Because like, just give me something for pain and let me die at this point.
So, yeah. So cancel culture is laser focused on judgment and accusation and punishment. Christ's goal, on the other hand, is love, mercy, and grace.
Like when he drove the traders out of the temple.
Well, exactly. So as with any, you know, here's Jesus engaged in some cancel culture right here.
Yeah.
You know.
Also,
you were already there. You were already there. Anti-capitalist.
Did you paint that yourself, Eric?
Yes, under my pseudonym Giotto.
That's okay.
That's very nice.
Thank you. But so that sort of covers the news for the week. I didn't know if you knew, but we are now facing the end times in addition to cancel culture. All the more reason we're going to need some enlightenment, I think. So Ted, I wonder if you might. I wonder if you might consider enlightening us about why was Steven Pinker among the folks that you thought was most worthy of a debate?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I have to say, I became I joined Twitter relatively recently, I guess, in the scheme of things. So, I mean, post Gamergate, I wasn't around online for all of that stuff. And I really joined it as a historian in the thick of the 2016 campaign, presidential campaign in the States. And, you know, there were all sorts of debates about history coming up in various ways, the Make America Great Again, sort of importance of historical narrative in framing one or another political position. So I was interested in that. And I was really, you know, though I work on the history of science, Pinker has not been on my radar really at all, or had not been on my radar at all before that. But when Enlightenment Now came out and he started publicizing the book, I saw, you know, this and that piece or interview with him talking about it and talking about, you know, among other things, how historians of science these days are all nihilists and they all hate science and they're all anti-science and they're also anti-enlightenment. And, you know, being someone who works on the history of science, works on the 17th and 18th centuries, who teaches, the Enlightenment course, other than the Scientific Revolution course. I think the Enlightenment course is the one I teach most often. I found this kind of wild because this is a guy I, have no particular set of associations with, except I know he's a big name Harvard figure who writes a lot of very popular books. And I didn't really associate him with one or another side in the culture war because I hadn't been, viewing that from a history of science angle at that point. But reading what he had to say, I was really struck by how silly so much of it was. And, I've looked at the book, and I've been, honestly, I'm almost as interested in the way Enlightenment has been taken up before, but especially since his book, I think, as a kind of battle cry in the culture war, and as something that has, on the one hand, a very pat meaning. It is, as to quote what is his group of things on the title, reason, science, humanism, and progress, I think, are the four things, the four pillars of Enlightenment. So it's just sort of flatly identified with these things, and discussion, it's invoked without any kind of, it's invoked simultaneously as this abstract set of goods that are timeless and universal, and at the same time as something that's very specifically tied to this one moment of history, and therefore a particular narrative of this history is somehow essential to the survival of civilization. And I mean, that's obviously counter to how historians do their work. It's counter to historical thinking. It's counter to any kind of open inquiry, which is sort of ironic, given that he's championing Enlightenment and open inquiry. So, I found that, something to think about and worthy of criticism. And I will say that, I've been relatively isolated, I think, in the classroom from the impact of culture war stuff. I think by virtue of the fact that I'm an early modernist, I focus on the 17th century chiefly. I think if I were teaching contemporary or even slightly earlier US history, it'd be a very different story. All the Americanists I know, at the end of the year, they invariably get student comments saying they spent too much time on Black history, or they spent too much time on Indigenous history, or I signed up for, a US history class, not an immigration history class, that kind of thing. They get that all the time, and they've been getting that for years. As an early modernist, I mean, very few people really have strong convictions, I think, that they're aware of about the early modern period. So they don't come into it expecting necessarily a particular narrative, so they're not angry when they don't get it. But I will say that Pinker's book is one thing that has come up, and albeit in a small way, it's come up in such a way that, one or two students who are really into Pinker's arguments will then resist even reading some of the, assigned work from historians of science or sociologists of science, simply on the basis that it comes from historians of science or sociologists of science. Because, if you read his book, you will learn that these people are nihilists who are anti-Enlightenment. And so, that's just counterproductive in the class, and it makes teaching actually harder. Whatever narrative people are going to come out of this with. And I should also say, and I feel like I'm rambling, though you did invite me. So, at the end of the year, after having been exposed to my, presumably nihilist, Marxist, postmodernist, whatever takes on the history of science, I would say more students than not probably still have a sort of baseline progressive sense of the history of science, because that's such a strongly reinforced narrative, in half of what we read, and also everywhere outside the classroom. Right. So it just makes kind of teaching and getting people to even engage with the literature and to think critically about the sources a lot harder. So that's where I'm coming from on this.
But am I right in thinking, as you said, Pinker's argument it's not rooted in any history at all, is it? It's just him sort of saying liberalism, Enlightenment. It's like, it's this kind of, I don't know, like, is there a particular TV show or something that makes it look like, I don't know, it was like Isaac Newton, the apple fell on his head, and ever since. And, there's like these sort of heroes, Galileo. It sounds like, it's almost like a children's book version of history. And yet, I don't think Bill Gates is making up that this is his favorite book of all time. Like it doesn't that say something about kind of our supposedly intellectual elites that they think that this person is a genius.
Yeah. Can I say something?
Yeah.
As a medievalist, I actually identify with what Ted's saying and take it that step further, I think, because it's so much further back, and people often just say, well, you can't be a historian of medieval, science or medicine, and we can debate those terms as much as we want, but I know what you mean, and I actually would say that Pinker is very dangerous. I think this kind of book, it's basically a sort of a prop or even an apology or apologism for kind of rampant capitalism. I'm sure eugenicists like it. I'm sure they do. I'm sure the skull measurers love it, because it's that defense of. It's also very dangerous because, like with his violence book, it's kind of saying, well, these are all bad things that are in the past. They're all in the past now, and they don't happen now. No, they don't. Bad things don't happen. La 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 la.
Yeah.
And I just think it's amazing that, once again, you've got a white man who thinks he can just write about whatever he wants. And if I did that, I'd be quite rightly, if I wrote about whatever it is that he's supposed to be a specialist in, I'd be rightly laughed out of town. But I wouldn't, right? I would say that Steven Pinker isn't, a joke. I mean, this is I think it's dangerous, and I just wonder what other people think about that.
But how is Steven Pinker considered this like heterodox? I mean, I feel like this goes to the whole heart of the kind of Caliper, Quarterly, Quillette. Have they been around 5 years? Jesus. But what's this formulation in which Steven Pinker, Harvard professor, used by Bill Gates and every other TED Talk, or like in what way is he not the most mainstream person on this topic?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I will say there's a kind of element of that in a lot of the arguments that these same, very well platformed, very prominent people are putting forward. And you see it in Pinker's book too, where, on the one hand, the Enlightenment is essentially, he doesn't actually say this, although Lindsay and Pluckrose, I think, do in something they published on Quillette. Enlightenment is basically modernity from their point of view. In his point of view, it's got, it's these four key things that are all huge things. But he also identifies it, I think early on, and so part one of the book is the sort of the historical part, to the extent that there is a historical part. I think that's the first few chapters. And he says, these are the origins of basically every modern institution. So that enables him to do a couple of things later on in the book. So there's part one, there's part two of the book, which is the graphs, and part three of the book is the sort of who's fighting Enlightenment right now, who is the counter Enlightenment today, and it's mostly academics and Trump. Anyway, so Enlightenment is the origin of all of these institutions. It's dominant. We're basically all do what we will, products of the Enlightenment. Therefore, anyone with any problem with any of these modern institutions is virtually by definition going to be counter-Enlightenment. But and anti-modern and so forth. And yet at the same time, all of these institutions, which are all the institutions we have, which we've all been raised up in, which go back to the Enlightenment per this book, are somehow also under threat, massively endangered by the very people who inhabit them in many cases. So, it is very much having it both ways in that same sense. Yes, I'm a Harvard professor. Yes, I sell millions of books. I'm everywhere. But I'm also an embattled, minority of one facing off against the world. And somehow, that juxtaposition doesn't really seem to jar anybody, or at least any of his readers or any of his fans.
Yeah, so I suppose, because I mean, when you mentioned Pinker, and obviously following along with what, because he was very, I distinctly remember him being one of the first to highlight that so-called squared hoax, and to be like, look at this is amazing, that it shows everything we ever thought about the woke. At that time, I don't even think woke, they were probably still using SJWs back then. But it seems to me like he is the kind of embodiment. In Britain, there's also Nigel Bigar, who was in GB News last week, is probably the equivalent of someone who is so prominent and out there constantly saying how he's being attacked. And it's sort of like, I wish I was attacked to the tune of however many millions the Gates Foundation is giving this man. Or, you know, obviously in the past we've got Jeffrey Epstein, who all of a sudden, no, I didn't know him at all, despite... I mean, is there any sense that... Does he just have no shame, or is he lying, or what is going on, do you think?
I don't know if I should take that. I mean, my own view is that it doesn't really much matter. I mean, whether he believes it or not. I feel the same way about James Lindsay. And there's a lot of, is it an act? Yeah. Is it not? I mean, who cares? What he's putting out there is the same either way. The effect it's having on the audience is the same either way. I don't really care what's in his heart. It doesn't matter to me. I'm never going to know it anyway. So, we can move on to the next question.
I absolutely agree. It's like, okay, so he might be a grifter or not, but really the effect is the same, isn't it? Yeah. There is something a little bit worse about grifters, though. But, yeah.
I guess it's more comprehensible that way, I suppose.
But yeah, here's this classic, photo with Krauss as well, because there is this. I mean, because one of the things that he really draws attention to is that there is this kind of intellectual like in sociology. When I was studying, say 2008, there was like this theory of the transnational capitalist class, like the global kind of elite of owners of production and so forth that had gone beyond the bounds of a single nation. And I feel like Steven Pinker is a member of whatever the intellectual equivalent of that is, where these are folks that get sent out to Davos, that get sent out to, I don't know, different, is it Santa Fe Institute's slightly better, but there's all these like think tanks and so forth, TED Talks. And what is it? There's, as you said, about what's in his heart versus there's clearly an audience for this progressive narrative of everything's great and anyone who criticizes is actually the enemy, not the person completely making stuff up.
Yeah. It's a stirring call to inaction. I mean, it's just weird to sort of present yourself. I mean, this is going back to your earlier point. I'm not saying anything new here, I don't think, but it's really peculiar to present yourself as this persecuted minority who's in favor of things exactly the way they are. I mean, it just kind of inherently doesn't make sense. I guess one of the more insidious things about the book, taking it as a statement about history, whether or not it's a history. This is something I think David Bell points out in his review of it, which I think was in The Nation. And I doubt he's the only historian to point it out. But, there's no real causal connection between all this stuff that supposedly was, the 18th century Enlightenment and everything that flowed from it, which includes pretty much, everything good in history post 1800. And you're just, I guess, supposed to get the idea that these ideas, right, that reason, science, humanism, progress, that these became convictions, and that was enough. Mm-hmm. There were no social movements, there were no revolutionary movements, there was no kind of collective action of any kind, there were no protests, right? None of that. That's just sort of eradicated from history. You leap from good ideas in the 18th century to all the stuff we have now. And, it's really quite perverse because...
dangerous, like I said.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, well, because I mean, I haven't read as much of the book, but I know that in the violence one, he's kind of talking about the wars and that those were just abnormal
Right.
issues of modernity. Like, whoops, sorry about that. World War II, like millions of people. It's kind of like there's a huge literature, and so this gets back to some of the general grifting qualities, and maybe it's worth thinking about the wider context in which these grifters are kind of spawning, but this kind of unwillingness to engage with any of the actual scholarship in these areas. So, for example, there's a huge literature on is World War II and the Holocaust and Nazism, are these features of modernity, or are they or Enlightenment or whatever? I mean, Christ's Dialectic of Enlightenment, it's like in the title, but I mean, what is it about him that's just, is the dismissal just an easy way of saying, oh well, all of these people are just naysayers? So, but actually, I don't have to read their book because I've already decided that. Or is it just a kind of like, I don't know, what is this unwillingness to engage with scholarship while at the same time saying reason and science and presumably scholarship are the greatest things humans have ever created?
Yeah. I think there's kind of two things this puts me in mind of. One is his discussion of, he briefly mentions Dialectic of Enlightenment, and I don't have the page reference in my head, but he says, there are these people attacking Enlightenment, blaming Enlightenment for various ills of modernity, including the Holocaust. And, that he falls back on this thing, which honestly is actually a move that I think Tucker Carlson has also made, which is that, genocide was just the norm before the Enlightenment. Racism, slavery, and he has a sentence where racism, slavery, I think genocide, and maybe one or two other things are just, described as, these were ubiquitous throughout history. Citation needed, of course. And so it's wrong to blame the Enlightenment for that because, to the extent that these are no longer the norm, we owe that to the Enlightenment. And, I guess to the extent that these ever still happen, that's just not being enlightened enough. But he then says, to go a little further, that it's really grotesque of, Adorno and Horkheimer and other people to lay any blame at the door of the Enlightenment for the Holocaust, because that's letting the Nazis off the hook. That's a phrase he uses. And I find that really curious because he's just let everybody off the hook, a couple paragraphs before. If these are just normal things, these just happen all the time, then, who's really to blame for any of them? So it's a kind of weird move because, all these evils are totally normal. Nothing can really be blamed on anybody, except the good stuff, which can be credited to the Enlightenment. And if the bad stuff still happens, well, that's
that's
read. But the second thing I wanted, I just wanted to put this out before I forget it, is that, there are a lot of people, and I think there's, to the extent that there's kind of good reasons, I don't think they are in fact good reasons, but to the extent there are sort of plausible reasons for making these kinds of argument, I think it's that, and I'm not sure they're his reasons either, I think it's that, giving any ground might seem to undermine scientific claims. So if you're committed to the idea that, scientific research is what's going to solve our problems, you don't want to undermine faith, and it is faith in that. And there are also reasoned, there are more or less informed views one can have of science, but when you have people saying believe science, believe the experts, that is, it's an appeal to what people believe, basically beyond their own expertise of necessity, because these are highly specialized disciplines. And I think anything that might undermine that is anathema. And I think we are dealing with various kinds of global crisis in which, obviously, scientific expertise in various fields is essential. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic right now. I think all of us are aware of some of the dangers that challenges to or undermining medical expertise presents in that context. But I think that gives you a choice. Are you as honest as possible about the limitations of what you're doing, and at the same time, are you trying to educate people as much as you can about how these things work? Or are you just going to sort of say, well, this is science, capital S, and what you're doing is faith, or is like a religion, or is ideology?
Right.
And I mean, if you take these descriptions of the Enlightenment as a matter of reasoning and open debate and critical engagement at their word, you really only have one choice there, and it's not the choice that Pinker's making, right? It's not sort of presenting science as essentially something you believe in, or your counter Enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
It's you have to kind of unpack how science works, how specialists in this or that field actually do their work, what the limitations are. But that's harder, right? It's a lot easier to say science is good. Here's my book.
Well, and that's interesting because I mean, I was thinking of that in the context of the pandemic, when you mentioned it, because there are these kind of the overlap with the grifters and the anti-vaxxers are interesting. Like, there's starting to be some fragmenting with like Brett Weinstein and Heather Haling versus Sam Harris and so on. But in general, there's like a tendency to go towards the anti-vax It's like a kind of hyper-skepticism that leads to kind of ultimately the libertarian basis upon which they started, which is I get to do whatever I want. And there is no, I owe nothing to society whatsoever. Right. But in terms of like, why would it be, and to my mind, for a public understanding of science, actually the kind of history of science perspective, the sociology of science, this kind of like idea that science is socially constructed, which isn't the same thing as saying there's no such thing as reality, but just that society is influencing what is considered scientific at any given moment, and that in turn influences what society is like, and there's like feedback between those two things, that would actually be helpful for the public to understand in the context of the pandemic, when someone says we're following the science, and that you have a government that's like changing the science that they're following based off, because there's like different groups vying for attention, and ultimately it's what power decides is true at any given moment can be called science, right? But that would be useful to understand, and yet it strikes me as really problematic to have this kind of science with a capital S understanding of science, because ultimately that is just kind of science is whatever the state says. If Donald Trump says he's following the science, that's what science is, because there's only one single science. So it's unclear to me as to like even how that's related to liberalism. It's almost a kind of like totalitarian idea of science that these folks present, and it's not an accident that they also like race science and phrenology and so on. But
transphobia.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I guess it just goes to this kind of like. I don't think I'm against science. Like, who's against science? You're
on a laptop right now.
And yeah, I am against them, but I think it's because it's like there's like scientism versus science, and they seem to wrap themselves in this mantle of science without actually even seeming to engage in it at all.
Yeah, the defense of scientism has been interesting, because that's something that comes up in his book briefly. One of these passages, where I don't have it in my head, but where he's identifying some of the sort of current enemies of counter enlightenment, or enemies of enlightenment. There have been attacks on scientism, which I mean, in my, just before I was a historian, when I was a student growing up, I mean, scientism was, for me, meant, like, by definition, an excessive belief that, this one approach or the scientific approach is going, will apply to everything. So it's not anti-science. It's pointing out that there are domains, right, where this or that set of ideas or practices are pertinent, and there are domains where they're not. But he, and also I think Clara Lehman, both have sort of engineered this position where scientism itself is a good thing and attacking that is bad. And I don't know, I find that interesting, I guess. I don't know what more to make of it than that. But I mean, there is a kind of weird alliance between people who are asserting the authority of a capital S science, and also people who are claiming that the institutions that produce most of this science are overrun by postmodernists. And it's sort of the same way there's a kind of weird alliance of people at the very top of some academic hierarchies, people like Pinker. I mean, Peterson is, tenured professor at top university in Canada. He's a very prominent academic. But their sort of fan base is largely composed of people who think that academia is a crock, that it's, overrun by Marxists and so forth. So I don't know that I've seen anything that makes sense for me of that particular alliance. And I mean, when you have people kind of quoting Peterson's, Hirsch index score as sort of evidence that he's a more serious person than you, because you're just an academic. I mean, what are you doing? Yeah. So, I mean, there's this weird sort of kind of paradoxical, I guess, alliance of groups that you would think would be kind of counterpoised to each other, both within sort of their attitude towards science and within, relatedly, their attitude towards academia.
Yeah. Well, and the most extreme example of that is sort of Lindsay's alliance with Christian nationalists.
Oh, yeah.
Because, I mean, he would have been coming from atheism into now it's just essentially, full-on Christian theocracy. He was at the, what was it, the CPAC or the Charlie Kirk thing the other day. But what I was going to ask about was this kind of, as you were saying, this alliance, because there's something about these folks as well that's very kind of like 1990s or like even 1980s. Like the audience as well seems to be engaging with this kind of like phantom academia that they encountered when they were undergraduates in like the late 90s, early 2000s, something like that. And they've not subsequently read anything since. And yet they're kind of like, oh, look at all these people with like postmodern, like even postmodernism. I don't see a huge number of card-carrying postmodernists like around today, and yet
enrollments are down.
What is that? What is that?
I was just going to say, isn't postmodernism just one of those words now, like woke or cancel culture, which critical race theory, which just is kind of used to mean people I don't like, who have particular sorts of ideas, right? Isn't that the case?
It is a bit of a catch-all. I mean, I'm also a little skeptical that people who went to college in the late 90s and early, I mean, I graduated in 1999. I didn't read, I don't think I read any, like, for a course at least, any kind of these big name postmodernists who apparently held sway even then. So I don't know what to make of that. I mean, I guess I feel like there's always a kind of caricature of what students are being taught. And, often it's a caricature that's substantiated by, I think, kind of tell-all books or Jeremiads written by people at elite schools, decrying what some of their colleagues perhaps are doing at those schools. So, I mean, it's possible that if you were at Duke in the 90s, say, majoring in English, you were getting a heavy dose of postmodernism. If you were at the University of Maryland doing history, where I was, you definitely weren't. So, I just think these things get kind of elevated into pictures of how things are everywhere. I mean, it's like there's a lot of comment about this going on, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, about how every education story seemed to be about either Harvard or Oberlin, or maybe Berkeley. All the coverage of speakers getting protested or visiting speakers getting shut down, focused on 1 or 2 or 3 campuses, and a lot of the coverage of, ostensibly left-wing takeover or student radicalization across the U.S. is really based on stories from 1 or 2 places. There are people who think that the Evergreen College thing, that's all you need to know about higher education in the U.S. right now. One, that's getting pretty old even for Evergreen, but it's also one incident. So.
Isn't just to kind of build on that, isn't the building of this caricature kind of part of the creation of the grift? Maybe it's a grift, maybe it's not, but it means that you can, or thinker, whoever else can create persona that allows them to be analyzed in some way outside of the strength of their academic arguments, because they kind of they exist within it, they criticize it, and then they create a persona that exists outside of it by facilitating this caricature. So it becomes this kind of self-fulfilling argument. I think you're right when you say there's no way of truly knowing if he truly believes half the things that he says, but it does facilitate a space in which he is not analyzed with the kind of his inconsistencies of his scholarship.
Yeah.
Which as an academic should be, should be the kind of prime.
You would hope.
Yeah. Well, and it seems to me like it's this. One of the funniest things I find is there's one. I don't know very many of Steven Pinker's ideas, but one of them, which I'm assuming is not his creation, but I know that part of his argument with violence is that, in fact, violence has been going down, but because it gets covered on the news a lot, it actually looks like it's getting worse. And sometimes I think about that, and I'm like, oh yeah, well that's probably true. It looks like violence is going up because of the coverage of it, when in fact the incidence of it is getting lower. But then it's like, why wouldn't you apply that to free speech and no platforming? It's like there's 2 or 3 times this has happened, and yet there are people convinced that this is an epidemic. And there's no reasoning with them, actually. There's no amount of evidence that can be presented to say, like, are you seriously talking about, like, these 5 things in the United States, a country with 4,000 institutions, as being, like, a major concern, warranting, like, new laws and so forth? And yet they do.
No, and do they even know that, is there any kind of, trend at all that we can be sure of apart from media coverage? Yeah, I don't know.
Well, because according to Eric Kaufman, who was the only person who did turn up for our show, but according to him, there's an iceberg. So the no platforming is really only just the tip of the iceberg of all of the people who won't sleep with you and all sorts of.
I missed that part.
Yeah, well, first it was they won't eat lunch with you, and then he's evolved now to there's girls at liberal arts colleges who won't sleep with the conservatives or something. And that proves that they're authoritarian.
Well, it's only so many times you can say freedom of association without it starting.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that.
Kaufman's gone full incel, hasn't he, really?
Yeah.
It's a little bit sad.
Well, because, when you're talking about what is linking all of these different folks, to my mind, going all the way back to when we were talking about Gamergate earlier, it's like there is a kind of hyper patriarchal sort of undercurrent to the whole kind of movement, in that if I were to suggest, well, what is the one most significant cause driving this radicalization of these free speech warriors, it would have to be the relative equalization of women in society would be the thing that's really driving a lot
I've been
of this.
thinking about this because a while ago Leon was talking about people that want smoking back in pubs, and how come these people are now suddenly linked with the transphobes. And the one thing that I think is really, really striking is a desperation to be oppressed where there is no oppression. And I think you can apply that to so-called gender-critical feminists. You can apply it to people like Pinker at Harvard saying, "I'm oppressed." You could apply it to the pub people who want smoking back. And I think, to me, that's quite a striking link between all of these groups. But I'd be interested to hear what others think on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that's probably right. I guess, which kinds of change, which forms of social change, or which forms of inclusion, or however you want to put it, are driving the reaction. I tend to suspect it varies a bit from figure to figure and from group to group. I think about a lot of the fuss over, one of the many ways in which Western civilization is currently being destroyed is by having people read things that weren't written by, authors of the Western canon. And, so I feel like inclusion of women writers, inclusion of Black writers, inclusion of non-Western figures in these, once fairly rigidly defined canons, I think that drives a lot of reaction. Even in cases where, if you look at what's actually going on, it's mostly additive, right? Where people are not having things taken away so much as they're being given new options, or in some cases, their course requirements change. That does happen. So, I feel like any kind of move that can be presented as, we're losing ground, right? We're not reading John Locke as much as we were anymore. Or we're not studying European history. That's not a required course anymore, right? Or we have world history instead, or whatever it might be. I feel like that always generates some kind of broadly similar reaction. I mean, in Canada, I'd say more efforts to teach Indigenous history. That's been a big flashpoint going back at least several years at this point. And, in the US, it's stuff like the 1619 Project, right? Which isn't actually taking anything away at all, right? That's just presenting a new narrative. And yet, right, that's supposedly, destroying history and also destroying society, turning people against each other and so forth.
Yeah, and so much that it needs to be banned. So then now Texas, I think, banned the curriculum, along with Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail is apparently critical race theory now. So don't know how that worked out for Martin
free
Luther
speech.
King.
It doesn't matter.
But it does make me think, though. There's two things that I'm thinking of. First is there is the issue of the canon, and there's what you're saying is correct. I think that it's additive when you look at what is being suggested, whether it's decolonization of the curriculum. It's kind of like, let's talk about new historical events, not let's get rid of someone's, mediocre history. It's like, let's supplement it with someone else. But where I think that these folks, and I do think it is particularly white men, get hung up is the idea that there's going to be hires in academia based off of these new areas of scholarship, and therefore they're going to get left out if we all of a sudden do, Black women writers of the 19th century. It's like, oh shoot, I do Charles Dickens. Oh no, what am I going to do? And then, that anxiety is all. It's not like the fault of the person, trying to study Equiano or whatever. It's the fault of the person. It's like academic precarity. and the fact that, jobs aren't expanding and everything that's wrong with academia,
Yeah.
structurally, it's not like it's not the inclusiveness is not the thing causing this existential crisis,
No.
but it is a displacement that sort of takes this anxiety and says, who's to blame? It's all this like women and diversity and equality agendas that are going to get rid of the gender pay gap, which means the fact that there's only 30% women on the faculty means that they're going to double the amount of hires by women, which means, these folks just seem to want to go back to the 1950s when it was all men, because they're like, that was awesome.
Yeah, sometimes they're pretty explicit about that. Yeah, I mean, I think there are all sorts of, like, any complaint you might have, I mean, you can find a scapegoat for that, right? I mean, I don't think, despite the way, I or we are sometimes talked about, I don't think academia is in great shape right now. If you're looking for an academic job, you have a real tough time ahead of you, no matter who you are. And that's been the case for a long time, again, no matter who you are. If you're worried about falling enrollments, I think it's very easy to say, well, back when I started 30 years ago, we had great enrollments and all we taught was European history. And now we teach all this other stuff and look at where we are. And so I think there are a lot of different problems that can easily be sort of displaced onto things that have actually been positive developments for in academia, whether we're talking about diversifying what we teach or, who gets to be in academia. So I think and often, it's going to be women, or it's going to be Black scholars, or it's going to be, non-white men, basically. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Well, and just thinking, because I know we're sort of nearing to the end of the time we have today, but I was just thinking about what is uniting folks like Steven Pinker and Quillette, and because I just was reminded of the kind of Quillette as being founded on the blank slate, and how that's just such a taboo thing to say. That that does cut across like gender. This idea that there's like, because I can't even quite work out. Oh no, they're against the idea of blank slate, which is a credit to like Hobbes or whatever, or is it Locke? And so it is biological. So there's biological gender, there's biological, race and IQ, and anyone who denies this is somehow anti-science, regardless of the fact that those specific scientific claims have been disproven. But I mean, in that sense, is Steven Pinker the kind of like source of this by being anti-blank slate? Is that ultimately what we're talking about here?
Yeah. I mean, I don't feel like I have been involved in these discussions long enough to be able to give a very good answer to that. I mean, there are people who followed, new atheism and all that from way, way before I was aware of any of this. So I don't want to say too much there, but I will say, I mean, he gives these people a vocabulary to work with for sure. And I was also surprised, actually, when going through the book, at the extent to which a lot of the kind of argumentative moves that characterize, the group of people who once labeled themselves the IDW, and the intellectual dark web, to what extent a lot of those arguments and a lot of those sort of argumentative tactics are taken up in that book. And so I mean, there's a sort of the blank slatists is one thing. I mean, one other thing is just sort of gets back to what Carl was saying in terms of building up a kind of persona that you can attack. There's a kind of characterization of your enemies. In this case, the enemies of enlightenment. Here's the things that the enemies of enlightenment are into, right? They're into faith, they're into superstition, they're into collectivism, they're into a whole slew of things. And you build up this sort of character of this person or group or party that you are opposed to. And that can then be deployed against any criticism of your position. And I mean, you see this was the whole thing with grievance studies, right? There is no grievance studies. There never has been a grievance studies, but they kind of conjure this umbrella term for a sort of fluctuating bunch of tendencies that they don't like in academia, and a set of fields they don't like, but that also fluctuates, especially gender studies, but expanding from there to include pretty much the humanities or beyond as needed. And then, if you're critical of that, then you're just a grievance studies person. So it kind of forecloses on any real discussion of what people are actually doing in any of these fields, or what people are actually teaching or being taught in classrooms. So in that sense, I feel like, Pinker does that in the book. He kind of flattens Enlightenment into these very few large abstractions, which he, subsequently revealed he's not even that committed to having this be their historical origin.
So that strikes me as a highly religious retelling of science. I mean, it's like, here's this origin myth, and we must believe in these 4 values. And if you go against the priest's position and sort of, or the imam's, understanding of what science consists of, then you are excommunicated. Like, you're a heretic, and you need. So it's like, it's not scientific at all. It's highly, it's like dogmatic.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't scientism kind of a religion when you think about this kind of adherence to particular types of science that say what people want, and science is, of course, not one thing or a kind of general. And so it is ironic, really, that all of these people that were into new atheism about 12 years ago are now kind of blindly unquestioning people like Steven Pinker. I mean, that photo is just haunting.
Well, there's no sense that, how many people have corrected them and pointed out, the supposed Mein Kampf thing was it wasn't similar at all, and they got booted from a whole bunch of things. Some of them were paid to publish. It's like, as you said, this idea of lumping everything together as grievance studies. I mean, that's really all that they accomplished, was creating a name for everything that they dislike. And then Steven Pinker has critical pomo what is an identity journal? I've never heard of such a thing. And then quote theory, like, there's no such thing as an actual, and there's no idea so outlandish that it won't be published. And as you find out, I think, 3 accepted, 6 rejected. So, I mean, most of them were rejected. So the system worked.
Square was really shit. It was really shit. It didn't succeed in any way.
Yeah, and yet people still talk about it as though these guys were like the genius Galileos of our time.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to the point about, how many speakers have actually been shut down, right? How many papers actually made it through? But if you have one kind of dramatic case, you have one sort of instance you can point to and riff on and elaborate on, then I think that was kind of the point, right? I mean, they spent a year trying to get maybe 1 or maybe 2 or 3 things past peer review. And, if it took 10 tries, if it took 30 tries, it doesn't really matter, because they're not really trying to make a kind of, data-based case about this. They're not really concerned with peer review at all, right? They're concerned with having a couple of embarrassing things they can point to again and again and again. And they got that. So I think as far as their audience is concerned, or as far as we're concerned, it looks silly. And it doesn't really establish anything, because peer review isn't, you're not, as a peer reviewer, assuming that the person you're reading is a fraud and trying to scam you, right? You're trying to look for, is there an argument here? Are there sources here? That kind of thing. Is this of interest to my, to the journal's audience that I'm reviewing this for? But, for their audience, that they don't know how peer review works. I mean, Claire Lehman thought peer review was having peers read what you do. I mean, or having people read what you do. They're not kind of attuned to the details of the process that they claim to be criticizing. They're really interested in coming up with things that they can broadcast that look bad. And they got that. So I think from their point of view, it worked fine. I mean, look at them now.
Yeah, I guess it all goes back to, again, why history of science, sociology of science would be helpful for people to know how the sausages get made to an extent. It's like peer review is not foolproof. It's not. It's often very busy people trying to do the best they can to maintain some kind of professional standards, and it's very easy to not. It doesn't work for even at the best of times. So that they manage to exploit those, those chinks in the armor makes a lot of sense. So I guess because we should probably think about wrapping up. On that note, as a kind of historian of science, early modern science, is there anything that we can do from your scholarship or to avoid the end times that are apparently on the way?
Oh, no pressure then. Oh, Lord. I mean, I do think that what I find heartening in this is that when students are actually reading these things, when students are looking at sources, historical sources, when they're reading historical scholarship and thinking about it, it does not really take very much for them to see that this is a complex process, right? Science, like every other human activity, right? It's a social process. It involves institutions. It involves politics, right? What questions get asked, what questions don't get asked. That's not something that just happens, right? That's something that's structured by the societies that people live in. And, that's a pretty intuitive point, really. As soon as you stop to think about it for a second. So I feel like, if we get away from who's pro-science and who's anti-science, because I don't even know what anti-science might mean right now, and just put sources, put some of the history in front of people, then you will get them thinking about it. And, whether they come out with a particular, belief that they can articulate in 10 words or less, I don't think that's that important, really. I mean, I think it's important that you get people thinking about how these things actually worked and thinking about them as complex processes, complex events that continue to be so in the present. And as a historian, I don't know that there's much more than that I can do.
No.
But
that sounds great.
That's it.
Yeah. No, well, that sounds like a really, I think that sounds like a good advert for history of science courses. Everyone should enroll. And pay more attention in general. And I just think read the sources, right? So much of this gets resolved when you actually check to make sure that the Enlightenment actually happened in the way that supposedly did. So, thank you so much, Ted, for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. We're actually going to be taking the month of August off, so we'll be returning back. I believe we have Jonathan Portes might be joining us, so we'll have more on that. Maybe put some statistics, some facts to folks like Eric Kaufman, Matthew Goodwin, and others claiming we've got this crisis that I've yet to see evidence of. But Ted, thank you for putting one more nail in the coffin of
thank you, Ted.
Supposed moral panic that we're living through, and I look forward to seeing you on Twitter soon.
Yeah, I'll be there. All right.
Nice to see you, Ted.
Cheers, Ted.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Y'all know what? He can't say what he thinks. Is that why?
His opinion is right.
Free speech